all at a dramatic time from a number of different points of view. The United States has the honor, in inverted commas, of being the next victim of Palestinian BDS. In fact, the Palestinian Authority and its chairman have boycotted, have BDS the American administration in their efforts to try to broker a long-term arrangement, diplomatic arrangement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Now, what's interesting about the boycotting of the United States is that it occurred over the United States' recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the first time that any U.S. administration has done that, and of course its promise forthwith to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Now, the Jerusalem issue that we are, all of us on this call are handling, or dealing with, or reading about, in these days, as the United States winds up to release its long-awaited diplomatic program, or peace plan, which they like to call it, is that Jerusalem is emblematic of the ideological war that the Palestinians have been prosecuting for decades, for 100 years even, up to 100 years against Israel. People here remember Hajj al-Amin al-Husseini was the first national religious leader, a precursor to the Islamic Jihad, and a close associate of Adolf Hitler, who embraced Islamic anti-Semitism and total ideological rejection on religious grounds of the Jewish people and its connection to Israel. And it's important that we talk about ideological war. I thought the invitation that Sarah and her colleagues put together was excellent, because there is a big disconnect in trying to understand the non-military aspects of the total war against Israel. It's becoming clearer and clearer, however, and the Jerusalem, as I said a minute ago, the Jerusalem issue, the recognition issue, is very important, emblematically, of the ideological Palestinian rejection of Israeli sovereignty in any borders, anywhere in the Middle East. As you're on the face of it, if you look at the Jerusalem issue, all the United States did was to recognize a connection, an historical connection, the second time that the international community has reasserted or reaffirmed Israel's historical connection, the Jewish people's historical connection to Jerusalem. The first, of course, being the Balfour Declaration and the San Remo Conference as the predecessors to the United Nations in recognizing the Jewish people's right to reconstitute. That was the language, reconstitute its capital and its homeland in Palestine. And here, what you have here is the U.S. administration essentially making good on its promise, the President of the United States making good on his promise to his constituency to move the embassy, which he did, having absolutely no effect whatsoever on the Oslo Accords, because he still left it to the parties to negotiate the final status of Jerusalem directly and bilaterally. But the extraordinary and dramatic emotional rejection by Abbas of the United States and of Israel with regard to Jerusalem is reflective of statements that he's made recently and over the last years, calling for the every drop of blood. You can find this on YouTube. Every drop of blood is holy in the war for Jerusalem. The Jews should keep their dirty feet off the Temple Mount compound and the holy sites in Jerusalem. And of course, his predecessor, Yasser Arafat, the first chairman of the PLO and the Fatah and the Palestinian Authority, engaged in wholesale temple denial, that there was ever any connection between the Jewish people and Jerusalem. And in fact, he had, at the time, many of you on this call remember, freaked out former President Bill Clinton on that point. Beyond that, Arafat had made, in the late 1990s, Jerusalem as the flashpoint to try to mobilize Islamic and Arab forces across the Middle East against Israel. And this is basically emblematic of an ideological rejection of any Jewish connection to the Middle East. There's, in fact, in the book that I authored called BDS Unmasked: Radical Roots and Extremist Ends, the foreword was penned by Brigadier General Yossi Cooperwasser, who is a scholar at our Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and he was the former head of intelligence assessment for the IDF. And he wrote in the preface something that hasn't been written before in a non-military context, and that is that the Palestinian total rejection of Zionism is based on a number of different pillars. And these pillars come from his work at IDF intelligence. And just review a few of them. Zionism is a fundamental injustice that the result of Western colonialism that has to be defeated, is the language they uses, at all costs. Number two, the character, the evil Jewish character of the Jews in Israel, arrogant, power hungry, real anti-Semitic tropes that we've seen in classical European anti-Semitism and also in Islamic anti-Semitism, the Jews as the descendants of apes and pigs. This is the second pillar. In other words, it is very much the type of language that I spoke just a couple of minutes ago, where Mahmoud Abbas himself is saying about Jerusalem that the Jews should keep their filthy feet off the Temple Mount area. Really calling upon these classic anti-Semitic imagery and tropes. And three, Judaism is a religion. It is not a nation or a people. This is the third pillar. Very important, and we've seen this much more clearly in Israel. A good example of this is Abbas's recent speech, February 20th, 2018, in front of the Security Council, in which he noted, first of all, that Israel is an apartheid state, and also that Israel is a religion. We have nothing against Judaism as a religion. We reject the Zionists taking over our land. If you remember in a speech some months ago in front of the European Commission, he called upon Abbas essentially had said that rabbis had called for the poisoning of Palestinian water wells, and then apologized the next day for this inaccurate blood libel. And then in the apology, he said, we have nothing against Judaism as a religion. Now, it's a great proof text, those three words, Judaism as a religion. And that's the point I'm trying to make here in the fourth pillar, is that for them, Judaism, the Jews are connected to Judaism as a religion, but there is no national or peoplehood to Israel, and therefore there is no recognition whatsoever or acceptance whatsoever of any Jewish sovereign entity anywhere in the Middle East. Number four, that rejection is also rooted in Islam, and those of us who know that according to Islam, any land conquered by Islam can never be controlled or sovereign territory of any other nation than the Islamic nation. As we know, Dar al-Islam versus Dar al-Harb, the House of Islam versus the House of War. So these are just some of the pillars that General Cooperwasser brought with him and wrote in the preface as the former head of intelligence assessment at the IDF. So we have a real ideological problem. And the reason I raised this in the beginning of the phone call is that when we've been beating the BDS horse to death, as it were, in discussions over the last number of years. And what we at the Jerusalem Center, as early as 2009, had noticed is that BDS, the three letters BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, really are suggestive of a much deeper ideological problem. In fact, BDS is only the low-hanging fruit in what is really a poisonous food chain that ends with BDS. But if you go up the chain, it's the poisonous root of this food chain. If you go up the food chain, the reason that there's BDS is that there is something called delegitimization, and delegitimization exists and as a function of what I've read you now, but it means that Israel really is illegitimate. And the reason that Israel is illegitimate is that it is an apartheid state, according to this food chain and according to the whole BDS structure. And that nature of Israel as an apartheid state means that Israel has no right to exist, which ties in directly to these pillars of Palestinian rejectionism, of Zionism, and the Jewish people's sovereignty in the Middle East that I went over just a minute or two ago. And if Israel is an apartheid state, meaning it has no reason to exist, that is why there is something called anti-normalization. So anti-normalization, of course, is suggestive or reflective, calling into our memories our history with former apartheid South Africa, which the international community mobilized anti-normalization or engaged in anti-normalization of relations because the former apartheid regime was illegitimate. And this is the image into which Israel is being cast as a leper state, as an illegitimate entity that has no right to exist, the new South Africa. So therefore, you begin with apartheid, you move to anti-normalization because it's apartheid and therefore no right to exist. It then has the right and the duty for the international community to delegitimize it, especially with regard to the Palestinian leadership, the NGOs, in its attempt to influence the Palestinian public. And finally, you have the BDS expression or the economic warfare that is reflective of the rest of the food chain. So BDS has to be considered in the context of these four elements of BDS: apartheid, delegitimization, anti-normalization, and BDS. They all go together. They cannot be separated. And unfortunately, the West has, especially in Europe, they have separated out BDS from the larger ideological war. And that's why I'm very happy that Emet and Sarah at its helm and her team were willing to discuss the ideological war, because that is really what we face opposite the Palestinian Authority, the Fatah, the leading faction, the PLO, the umbrella group of the Palestinian, I would call it Islamic Qum national movement. Now, if we look at these pillars, one of the most prescient examples of these pillars, the pillar that is essentially number two, which is the anti-Semitic pillar, the image of the Jew as arrogant, power-hungry, bloodthirsty. This is the type of blood libel, the blood libeling of Israel that we have seen on a number of occasions. You remember, not only Abbas talking about the dropping of the sanctification of Palestinian blood and Jews keeping their filthy feet out of Jerusalem, but in fact, we have seen over the last number of years accusations like Abbas made in front of the European Commission just months ago, that Israel poisoned Palestinian water supplies. Now, we've seen that water supply poisoning libel on a number of occasions. We saw it with Arafat and the Palestinian Authority through the 90s. Israel poisons water supplies. Israel injects young Palestinian girls and boys, and this is really serious, you can look this up, with progesterone in order to first turn them on sexually and then sterilize them. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. They have accused in the late 90s, 1997 to be exact, there was an accusation coming out of Arafat's Palestinian Authority that Israel was actually lacing chewing gum with chemicals that would shorten the lives of those who consumed it, and then Israel was then selling this infected, poisoned, chemically tainted chewing gum, as you will. And it goes on and on. Israel deals in body parts. These classic anti-Semitic themes have been part and parcel of the blood libels of the Palestinian Authority, and those stem directly from the 6 pillars of rejection of the Palestinians towards Israel. Now, you may remember this didn't start in the 90s. By the way, it started the first time we saw it in out of the PLO was really in 1993. Some of you may remember this story. It was covered very widely by the international press, in which hundreds of Palestinian girls in 1983 suddenly and mysteriously became ill and they were taken to hospital. There was apparently some powder, some brown powder found on the windowsills of schools in Tulkarem, in Jenin, in Hebron, and it infected more and more young girls, and they were all taken to hospital. Israeli doctors were called in, Palestinian doctors were called in, and Arafat and the Palestinian leadership called this an Israeli gas poisoning of Palestinian children. Now, this is way back before the Palestinian Authority was created. If you remember 1983, the PLO had been ejected from Lebanon under President Reagan, who was at the helm of the United States at that time, and the PLO was sent to Tunis with great shame and embarrassment. They were thrown out of Lebanon by the Israeli Defense Forces in the Lebanon War, and so they thought that it would be an effective act of political and ideological warfare to start this type of blood libeling, and they did, and it was actually quite effective. All of the mainstream media began to parrot the illegitimate Arafat, certainly illegitimate in the West, and yet it was determined that this was a hoax, but not before Israel invited the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, the World Health Organization, to do their own investigations and to determine that all of this was untrue, meaning that there was no poisoning of these young girls. It was either found to be psychological or found to be, and the materials were found to be pollen and others spoiled milk, dried milk. But this type of strategy of libeling Israel had really reflected the Palestinian political strategy of total warfare against Israel. Now, you might ask, so if it's so old, if it's 35 years old, well, why all of a sudden has it really become an issue? The answer is legitimacy, because at that time the PLO was illegitimate in the West. Yasser Arafat was understood to be the arch terrorist of the 20th century, having killed an American diplomat, Cleo Noel, in Sudan in the early 1970s, 1972, and therefore it had no traction. It had no traction in the West. All of a sudden, we fast forward to 2001 at Durban, and all of a sudden, that strategy of Yasser Arafat, which has been continued by his successor Mahmoud Abbas, became realized at Durban, where Israel became the ultimate evil actor at the Durban Conference on Xenophobia in Durban, South Africa, 2001. But the BDS movement and its apartheid accusation didn't really institutionally take hold until 2005 with what's called the PACB call in the 2007, with the emergence of the Boycott National Committee. Now, what is really compelling here is that for those years, let's say 2001 until 2017, 16 years, Israel, just to demonstrate to you a major disconnect, liberal Jewish communities around the world and Israel, let's call it centrist Israel, those who are actively seeking to enter into peace processes, whether it was Prime Minister Olmert, Prime Minister Ehud Barak, whether it was former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's re-engagement or disengagement plan from Gaza, anticipating some sort of final deal. What we were on in Israel, and I think that we miscommunicated to many of our Jewish brothers and sisters around the world is that we were on one level of understanding, meaning that if Israel would only quit these territories, and it was these territories, according to many, that Israel controlled that were basically blocking any kind of Palestinian-Israeli accord. And what we find now, when we look back at the BDS movement with glasses that are clear and not rose-colored, and driven by blood libels and the apartheid libel, is that the Palestinians all along had engaged in ideological warfare, rejecting the concept of a Jewish nation-state in any sovereign package, any sovereign borders anywhere in the Middle East. So the trouble was that Arafat was fully legitimized, and then his successor, of course, Mahmoud Abbas, who is Israel's negotiating partner, has been fully legitimized by Israel and the international community, and yet they both hold the same positions with regard to Israel's illegitimacy. So now we fast forward to the apartheid rejection of Israel, and this is a very sophisticated and very dangerous convergence of legitimacy and ideological warfare, because since the Palestinian Authority is considered the legitimate negotiating partner of Israel, then whatever claims the Palestinian Authority leadership makes against Israel are really considered basically just a counterclaim to the claims that Israel makes. So if Israel talks about terrorism, they talk about apartheid, occupation, and colonialism. And therefore, we have a false moral symmetry between Israel and the terror-sponsoring, blood libeling entity called the Palestinian Authority that we're trying to deal with. Now, the apartheid packaging of Israel's illegitimacy is actually very smart from their point of view, because you have a prototype, the former apartheid regime, and then you basically you cast Israel as the new apartheid regime, and it begins to take hold, even though on a one-to-one comparison, the comparison is totally absurd. And this is the sophistication of this libel. Is that if you look at what apartheid was, I happen to have been a competitive tennis player, highly ranked in the United States, went to apartheid South Africa in the 1970s and witnessed what apartheid was. And what apartheid was, that many people on this call probably know, is a system of white minority government in South Africa of white racial superiority. Apartheid was synonymous with white racial superiority that determined that blacks couldn't drink out of the same glass, that black South Africans could only live in particular areas, that they could not mix in restaurants, in beaches, at schools, at tennis courts, at any kind of social, athletic, political, civil facility. Total racially based separation based on white racial superiority. Well, it is extraordinary that Israel could even be compared in truth and in fact to such a system when Israel is a non-European majority democracy that is the only country in the West that, at huge expense and great risk to life, went in to save tens of thousands of Africans from certain death in its saving of Ethiopian Jewry. Of course, the United States brought black Africans to enslave them, as the Arabs and the Europeans did. And Israel is the only country among Western powers that liberated black Africans, as opposed to the rest of the Western powers of enslaving them. But that notwithstanding, obviously in Israel, the Arab minority, Muslim and Christian communities, one man, one woman, one vote, fully protected under Israeli law. Palestinians are Supreme Court justices. Palestinians are leading lawyers, doctors, contractors, academics, and so on and so forth as it goes. and which is not to say that there isn't discrimination. There is discrimination, as there is in the United States and as there is in any Western democracy, and that is the beauty of a democratic system, is that you have an independent judiciary and a very vibrant media, which Israel clearly, as many of you know, has a very, very vibrant media, both in English and in Hebrew and in French and in Arabic and so on. But the one-to-one comparison is totally ridiculous. And yet, the danger here is that it has taken hold in mainstream Western discourse. And this has been the Palestinian strategy, by the way, that casting Israel as an apartheid, illegitimate state that has no right to exist would take hold in the international community. I'd like to take you back just for a minute to when to the birth moment of this idea. And it wasn't in Durban in 2001, my friend. It was back in 1974. The month was November. Yasser Arafat stood in front of the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York in his famous speech in which he said, Zionism is racism, meaning the national movement of the Jewish people to recover its sovereignty after 2,000 years of dispersion is basically an illegal, illegitimate move that is bound and rooted in Western imperialism, colonialism, racism. So by saying Zionism is racism, which took hold in after his speech in 1974, those of you who remember, within 12 months to the month, UN General Assembly Resolution 3379 took hold and was passed, and that cast Israel, Zionism is racism. Now, what is the central claim of Israel as an apartheid state? That it's a racist state, because apartheid was a racist regime, was based on racial superiority. So in effect, Israel suffered for 16 years, from 1974 to, or 17 years, 1975 to 1991, 16 years, until the Zionism is racism canard was, though it was passed in General Assembly, was overturned in 1991. That was the moment that in 1974 that Israel was cast as an apartheid state, and that is what we're dealing with today. So that strategy has survived and has strengthened, has been bolstered. Now, if we fast forward to today, Israel as an apartheid state may seem absurd. It certainly is absurd to me and to many others in Israel and in the Jewish world, people who know what apartheid was, but it has taken hold in the mainstream discourse, on social media, at the best universities, in diplomatic circles, in the mainstream media, in academia, on campuses. And today, it is a completely legitimate question or statement to say that Israel is an apartheid state. And we see most recently a disturbing trend where this notion has been advanced by Palestinian intellectuals who are now assistant, associate, and full professors at American universities. And I'm thinking of Professor Sari Magdisi of UCLA, who published a absolutely atrocious piece, but dangerous, in the University of Chicago Quarterly, which is one of the most prominent academic quarterlies in the United States of any university, especially coming out of the University of Chicago, which is not exactly communist central, or progressive central when you talk about universities. But here he cast with 50 or 60 footnotes proving that Israel, not the West Bank, not Judea and Samaria, or even the eastern side of Jerusalem, but Israel as it exists since 1948 is an apartheid, illegitimate state. And it's the legitimacy, it's the legitimization of that claim that is rooted in ideological warfare against the existence of a Jewish state that makes it so dangerous. You're already talking about influencing Jewish students who are more and more disconnected from the Jewish state for all kinds of reasons, from assimilation to millennial culture, which is quite different than the culture of the campus 30 years ago. And here you have the essential rejection of the concept of a Jewish state in its own ancient homeland being cast as an event, an occurrence, a phenomenon that's totally illegitimate, that is in fact apartheid. And that mainstreaming of apartheid is what is so dangerous. Now, what has Israel done about this? Well, I can say that, and this is sort of in a moment of self-reflection and self-criticism, I believe that Israeli governments and civil society have been much to blame for this ideological warfare that's been foisted on the Jewish state, and I think by extension the Jewish people. Many experience on campuses a pure anti-Semitic behavior for even expressing any kind of support or friendliness towards the state of Israel. And Israel has been in large part responsible because it had not, from the 70s forward, it had not responded to these expressions of whether they're blood libel, whether they're the blood libels that I mentioned before, or the libeling of Zionism as racism. Let's remember, it lived with that canard for 16 years in the United Nations. It was unable to correct it for 16 years. And then subsequently, when Arafat was making all of these horrendous slanders and libeling of Israel, poisoning water supplies, taking body parts, sterilization of Palestinians, poisoning of Palestinians, you did not see any particular response coming out of the governments of Israel because it didn't consider it strategically or existentially dangerous. Now we see that this type of non-military total warfare is dangerous because it threatens the national legitimacy, the national security of Israel via its legitimacy inside Israel as well as internationally. What I will say, as I wrap up these initial comments, is that in Israel, it is widely known now that these blood libels, this ideological warfare, is a non-starter, especially and that it is packaged as BDS. This is one of the few issues in Israel that has wall-to-wall acceptance. BDS is a non-starter because Israelis of all political stripes know that BDS really means Israel is apartheid, Israel is illegitimate, the entire Zionist Jewish nationalist enterprise is illegitimate. That is why you have a total wall-to-wall, from left to right, rejection of this whole BDS, international BDS campaign. Now, what is Israel doing about it? Well, Israel is taking it, official Israel is taking this type of ideological warfare much more seriously today in 2018 than it ever has before. Many of you know that 140 million shekels was budgeted by the government and placed into the capable hands of Minister Gilad Erdan, who's the Minister of Public Security and the Minister of Strategic Affairs. And today, I can say authoritatively that BDS is considered a national security threat to Israel because the BDS system, the international system of support, shares the same goals as the Hamas maintains, which is the elimination of Israel. Just as one example, as I'm explaining to you the reaction in Israel or the strategy in Israel against BDS, when you hear on college campuses where you have Students for Justice in Palestine and Jews for Justice in Palestine, all of which are anti-Zionist organizations, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. You hear that refrain all over. And that's an indication of the total rejection of Israel as a Jewish nation state anywhere, in any borders. And that plays back to what I said about 25 minutes ago, which is one of the pillars of Palestinian rejectionism of any Jewish national sovereign entity, state, anywhere in the Middle East. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That is the proof text that BDS does not seek to create a Palestinian state next to Israel. It seeks to establish a 23rd Arab Muslim majority state instead of Israel. And so Israel, in recognizing this, has taken great strategic strides in bringing together friends and supporters and allies of Israel to to work against this type of what can clearly today be called anti-Semitic activity in Europe and in the United States. I was involved in a Knesset session where I testified on the whole apartheid libel aspect of BDS about 3 weeks ago at the Knesset. You can actually see that online. If you read or understand Hebrew, you can just go to Apartheid Diker in Hebrew, and you can see a number of different clips. One in English by a black South African whom we invited here and to show that the whole apartheid comparison is totally absurd. And he himself and his family had suffered from apartheid. His name is Luba Meakiso. You can see that in English if you put in Diker apartheid. That will come in as one of the YouTube. So Israel, the Office of Strategic Affairs has brought together lawyers, they brought together engineers, they brought together economists from around the world in order to fight this ideological warfare as expressed in BDS. And I do think that we're making a lot of strides. You know, the United States is leading the international community in the 25 or 26 states that now have outlawed BDS activity as basically as a discriminatory and anti-Semitic policy. And 50 governors of 50 states have signed a declaration rejecting BDS, as well as you have a vibrant NGO community working against this whole BDS phenomenon. In Europe, it's more of a mixed bag. On the one hand, you do have Germany, the United Kingdom, even France, not only under Sarkozy, but France under Macron has called BDS forms of anti-Semitism, and they have banned this activity locally, if not nationally. But you still have the problems whereby you have, the main leadership of BDS in Omar Barghouti, a Palestinian with Israeli residency, invited by the European Parliament to address the Parliament. So you still have a number of different acts like this. BDS being put up as a Nobel Prize candidate by a parliamentarian in Norway in a far left party. So you still have these tensions and these actions that are suggestive of the continuation of this ideological warfare led by the Palestinian Authority and the NGOs in Ramallah, and then very much celebrated and advanced by fellow travelers in Europe, and increasingly, unfortunately, on some U.S. campuses by anti-Zionist groups such as the Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine. But on the whole, you have in Israel complete unity on this issue, rejecting BDS, rejecting anti-normalization, rejecting delegitimization, and rejecting the apartheid blood libel against Israel. And I think that's the good news, because when Israel is united on an issue, which is very rare, few and far between, the echo effect is very strong across the oceans. And I think that is the direction that we are taking now, especially on this issue of ideological warfare. It's out in the open. It is no secret to anyone. And I think it's vitally important that Israel and Jews around the world be on the same page on this issue of BDS and ideological warfare, Israel as the apartheid libel, because that's going to be the ultimate test. If the Jewish people can act as a united front against this phenomenon, because it is very much a question of Jewish national security, Israeli national security, and legitimacy. And that is definitely something that's worth fighting for, and that we all should stand shoulder to shoulder in order to confront. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your patience with me and listening to this opening, and I'd be more than happy to take comments and questions from you wherever you are, wherever you happen to be. I think I would call it the soft heart of Israel as opposed to the soft belly. I mean, it reflects itself as the soft underbelly of the problem. But I think that, the average Israeli very much wants peace from the left, from the center, from the right. And it's only a question of how to achieve it, not if to achieve it. And I think that point number one. Point number two, Israel as a body politic has been very naive and rooted in ignorance about Palestinian and Arab and Islamic culture. And I think that the Islamization of the Middle East has brought out in an extreme way what some of the most problematic aspects of Islamic culture are, and that is what's helped everyone to wake up. And obviously massive terror attacks in Israel, as well as 9/11, as well as 7/7 in London, as well as the attacks in Madrid, in Bali, around the world, the hundreds of attacks around the world of radical Islam in France, and other areas throughout the European continent as well. And the ongoing war between Islam, some say radical Islam, and the West has, I think, emphasized and underscored to Israelis what is going on with the Palestinians, and that this is not a territorial conflict. Professor Bernard Lewis made that clear, Sarah, back in when he was young. He's 102 almost. When he was really young, like at 89, and he was coming in 90, he was coming to Israel and lecturing a lot. He kept saying, if this is a question of territory, it can be solved tomorrow. But he knew and suggested to those of us who were his students that this is a question of existence, not a question of territory. And I think that's what the Israeli body politic has come to realize. This is a question of existence. They did not realize that, or we did not realize that back in 1987 during the first Intifada. We understood it to be the rejection of the continuation of a situation that was untenable for them and untenable for us. Remember, that was 1987, before any so-called peace process had taken hold, not Madrid and not Oslo at that time. And so the question was what to do. But you've always had a readiness by the Israeli public to come to an arrangement with its Palestinian neighbors. Nobody wants to be a conquering power over another people. It's a question of how are we going to live safely and securely, with a leadership. I wouldn't even say a population. I truly believe, as somebody who does research every week in areas of the disputed West Bank, Judea and Samaria, that the average Palestinian worker and professional wants to live together with Israelis. I really, truly believe that. I see it on the ground. I go to Palestinian villages, and you do see, Sarah, a growing middle to upper middle class reality in many Palestinian areas. 1- and 2-car families, villas, people, those Palestinians who are working with Israel, making 3 times what they would make in the Palestinian Authority areas, are beginning to enjoy greater economic stability. And that's the direction we have to move into. But going back to your question, I think it's always been a question of Israel's naivete about Palestinian and Arab culture, Islamic culture, as well as a soft heart in wanting so much to solve this territorial issue. I think it is not an economic threat to Israel. That's what has been the deceptive element in the entire BDS international campaign, or the assault, is that it has been so much it has not been an economic threat of any national importance. The estimates that I saw recently is that even if there were intensified economic consequences, the effect on GDP would be negligible. And so therefore that's why we're focusing on the ideological aspect of the threat, because the threat is one of media. It's a media threat. It's a legitimacy threat. It's a threat of environmental poison, as opposed to Israel being Israeli shipping and Israeli high tech being refused in the international community. Having said that, we are seeing some sort of effect from the Jordan Valley exports of agriculture to European markets. And if you actually want to see Elchanan, who is the head of the Jordan Valley, the Jordan Valley municipality, the local council there, you can go onto YouTube and put, as I told you, the Apartheid Diker in Hebrew into Google, and you can see his little testimony in the same Knesset session several weeks ago and talk about for 5 or 6 minutes what the economic implications are. So there are some economic implications on a tactical level, in a limited level, But the big danger is one of, I think, national security. Cooper Wasser thinks it's national security because it is a question of ongoing. It is just like anti-Semitism. It does not have a termination date. It has a shelf life. It continues on and on and on, and there's no way of solving it. If you know, by the way, if Israel were to agree to a Palestinian state in the truncated parts of the truncated 67, post-67 lines, areas, this would not end because the ideological warfare is against the notion of Israel as the ultimate human rights violator, not in the West Bank per se, but in its existence, in its relationship with the Israeli Arab minority. That, by the way, is well demonstrated in one of the three requirements by the BDS movement. If you notice, if you go onto the BDS website, Boycott National Committee, BNC, they will say in order to stop the BDS activity, Israel will have to accomplish three things. Pay attention. This is actually a very important point. One, tear down the so-called apartheid wall. Two, stop the discrimination or to restore or fulfill the rights of Israeli Arab minorities as if they don't have democratic rights. And three, to recognize the so-called right of return, UN General Assembly Resolution 194. And notice that none of those three requirements, as stated by the BDS movement, have anything to do with the 1967 lines. And that is the proof text that they are not interested in the establishment of a friendly, peaceful Palestinian state next to Israel, but an Arab Muslim state to replace Israel. Yes, absolutely. It's an excellent question, and it's a key issue. I actually just before coming to the United States on this recent trip, was meeting with one of our two most prominent members of Knesset, Abraham Neguse, or Negusa, as some pronounce, who is of the Likud party, and Dr. Neguse is an Ethiopian member of Knesset, together with Penina Tamano-Shata, who is another member of Knesset, an Ethiopian woman, a very special lady from the Yesh Atid party. There is a future party, Yair Lapid's party. Both of these, I have meetings when I go back to Israel next week with both of these individuals, because we have seen in the case of dealing with South Africa, which everyone on this call knows has been behaving very problematically towards Israel, especially because they have no water, and Israel can solve that problem. But the government has preferred to make its own population suffer and not deal with Israel. But nonetheless, where we have been successful diplomatically is with Ethiopian Israelis who have gone there and are recognized as brothers and sisters of African descent. And therefore, I have claimed for many years that our UN ambassador should be an Ethiopian woman. And if that were the case, we would be able to revolutionize our diplomacy. I am convinced that the Israeli-Ethiopian community is a key, especially in 2018 and in a world which is as it is, to bring Israel forward diplomatically in many international organizations. Well, let me just respond. Say you're very right. In fact, what this call was a briefing on ideological warfare against Israel, and I started out by saying it's ideological warfare against the United States at this juncture, meaning the United States has now been BDS. But I think what you're talking about is something a little bit different. If you noticed, there is a current move right now in the United States to pass legislation called the Taylor Force Act, which has a sister legislation in Israel, because the Palestinian Authority is paying terrorists to kill Americans and others. And that has been an extremely successful campaign that we see has its engine is in the United States as well as in Israel. And that's the kind of thing I think that you're talking about.